Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Okay. So today we have among us Dhruva Jaishankar. He is the director of the US initiative at ORF. His research has spanned issues such as the India-US relations, India's relation in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, the interaction of technology with politics, and defense and national security. Thank you so much, sir, for being here, for taking your time. And I know you have been a little busy here and there out, but thank you so much for taking your time.
Thank you for having me.
So the US-India relationship has, at this point of time, where there's a 2+2 signing comes off at the time when India is locked in one of the most hostile standoff with China along the disputed border in the Himalayan region. Can you take us to the deal and tell us why this is important at this point of time and the significance for both India and US at this point of time?
So first, let me just speak a little bit about the 2+2 dialogue. This is a format that initially was quite unusual. It was something that is basically a foreign and defense ministerial meeting. It's held at the political level now between India and the US, but it's modeled on similar interactions that the US had with Japan and others, which was a sort of a political military dialogue at the highest levels between the two governments. There've been other efforts at sort of systematic engagement between the US and India in the past, led initially by, in the late 1990s by the deputy secretary in the US and Jaswant Singh, who was then external affairs minister in India. Subsequently, during the Obama administration, they had what is called a strategic and commercial dialogue, which was the commerce and foreign ministers meeting. But under the Trump administration, it has obviously taken on more of a security function, and the defense and foreign ministers now try to meet on an annual basis with more working level meetings held periodically to review progress on various things. So this is now a structural form of high-level engagement between the two countries as they've developed a closer partnership. In some ways, the current meeting, even though it was held just before the US elections, has been planned since December of last year. So it's been almost a year in the works. And a number of sort of overdue, long-pressing agreements were discussed as part of this. One of which, the one that got the most attention, was what's called the BECA agreement, which was a geospatial information sharing arrangement. From the US point of view, this was 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. There were a series of agreements that the US said, if you want a closer partnership between our two countries, you will need to sign on to a number of agreements which allow for a basic military cooperation that we have meaning in this case, the US has with its key allies and partners. In India, this took on, these are technical agreements, but these took on quite a political significance. And so while the negotiations started in 2005-06, in some ways, the first of these agreements was only concluded in 2016. So it basically went almost 10 years without concluding these agreements. And since then, pretty much every year, we've seen the conclusion of one more such agreement. The first was a logistics agreement called LMOA. The second was a secure communications agreement. There was also what's called the Industrial Security Annex, which helps with defense co-production and R&D. And then now the last one has been BECA. Again, in some ways, the political significance may be overstated. They sometimes I find are mischaracterized in, the LMOA agreement, for example, is sometimes I've heard people describe it as a basing arrangement, which it absolutely is not. It basically allows for the two countries' militaries to easily resupply each other, including in operational environments. So this, I think, is a very natural progression for the US-India relationship and has not necessarily been driven by the immediacy of the China standoff that India is facing currently.
But will this increase India's involvement when it comes to what US has been doing, the kind of escalation that US has been, um, in a way, provoking with China?
Mhm. So the short answer is not no. There's nothing so far in any US-India agreement that implies or even compels either party to do something at the other's behest. So, I mean, which is why I think it's not helpful to describe it as an alliance or even an emerging alliance. In fact, even US formal allies do a lot of things that are independent, even with China, that are independent of the US action. I think the other reality to keep in mind is India has its own contest with China and own competition with China, irregardless, of the US. So it's not just about the US-China competition. It's not the US driving India and China into competition with each other. India and China have differences that extend to the boundary dispute, which is of course flared up again this year, that extends to regional differences, including the concerns, very legitimate concerns about Chinese involvement in India's neighborhood, including the Indian Ocean region. It extends to very difficult trade and economic differences as well, including what India sees as non-market practices by China. And it also extends to differences on global governance and the definition of global, the defense of global norms. So on multilateral issues. So India has its own differences with China. These have arguably increased over the last 10 years or so. And the fact that India and China in parallel have their growing competition with China is certainly one of the drivers that has allowed these two countries, India and the US, to forge a closer partnership.
When we look at, since you mentioned China, so I have a question in China. It's like, how does India-US relationship shape in the future with the motive of tackling the Chinese hegemony? Initially, India has been hesitant on getting a partnership with US or being in line with US because India has ties with China as well, with a lot of trade that goes between India and China, and has been very hesitant. But right now, with the recent border dispute and the pandemic, US has been pushing India for a tie-up, and we have seen with Quad as well, has been tackling China. How do you think like US and India's relationship will shape up with the China aspect?
So actually, I would dispute in some ways your characterization of what has happened, because again, implicit in what you're saying is the fact that India has been reluctant and the US has pushed it into a position, say, on the Quad or something like that. That's actually not necessarily the best way of looking at it. Look, the fact is actually that India has less economic and social linkages with China than almost any other major economy in Asia, certainly. And that includes the United States. So I think a lot of people point at the trade figures, the goods trade figures, which have increased significantly. They increased from 3 billion or so in the early 2000s to 70 billion by 2012, and has been grown almost to 90 billion at times before the pandemic. So the goods trade figure has been very high, but that's very one-sided. It's mostly Chinese exports to India. India's exports to China rarely crossed over $20 billion. So it's not been a major, to the benefit of India. And the only way it has been somewhat beneficial is by lowering the cost of consumer goods and certain intermediary goods in the Indian market. But the US is much more economically integrated with China than India is. Japan is much more integrated with China than India is. So if you look right now, if there is talk today about the possibility of economies diversifying away from mainland China because of concerns about the politics and security disputes, India is in fact better placed to do that today than most of the other major economies, for whom this will be a long-term transit, much longer-term transition. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So the point I'm trying to make is India had its equity, certainly it has its equities with China. These include not just economics, but I think there was very genuine collaboration between India and China, for example, on multilateral issues as well, particularly after 2008, 2009. But that being said, most of the other countries in the region, including the US, have been hesitant to take a more competitive stance vis-a-vis China because of their own interests and equities with China. And this extends, again to a, economic, for some countries, they're very dependent on Chinese tourism, on Chinese investment, Chinese market access. So a combination of all of these things has meant, basically the realities of a globalized world and the fact that China is somewhat integrated into that globalized world means that it's been very difficult to assume a more competitive stance, even though China has been assuming that more competitive stance with most other countries in its region.
So External Minister K. Jaishankar a few weeks before has said that India will never be part of an alliance system with US, but do you think a military alliance system, but do you think in a US military alliance is something that is a possibility in the future?
So I think, again, the alliance is a very loaded term. And I think the reason to shy away, and the reason, I don't use the term alliance in describing the India-US relationship because it leads to the assumption in some quarters that this will be something like a mutual defense treaty, which is the kind of alliance the US enjoys currently with NATO and its European allies, and enjoys with Japan, South Korea, and others in Asia. So I think if we were to say, will India and the US have that kind of relationship? I don't think that is a realistic possibility in the near or even the medium term future. Both are democratic countries, and the US has made it quite clear that it has concerns about its existing treaty alliance commitments. So the reason in some ways, I think, not to talk about an alliance between the two countries is not to raise these unrealistic expectations on the part of the Indian or American establishments or the publics that they will be expected to come to each other's assistance automatically in the event of greater hostilities. That being said, today already, India and the US enjoy a defense partnership that would have been unimaginable 15, 20 years ago. And that is arguably more robust and more substantive than some of the US's existing alliances today. So, to give a few examples, Pakistan is still technically a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Today, the level of India-US defense cooperation far outpaces the level of cooperation between the US and Pakistan. And I think in some total, there's still certain things that Pakistan does that, for example, in the Gulf that India does not do. But I think if you take the full sum and substance of the defense relationship, it is today much more substantive. I see the relationship on the military side progressing in 3 dimensions. One is towards greater information sharing and common strategic assessments, not just bilateral, but on third parties, starting with the Indo-Pacific, but extending more broadly to places like Africa and West Asia. This includes consultations at the political level, whether it's between the 2 leaders or ministers or the bureaucracies and the militaries, of course, down to intelligence sharing on a day-to-day basis. So that's I'd say one dimension where we've seen progress and we will continue to see greater cooperation. A second area will be in terms of military interoperability. That is the ability of the 2 militaries to work in tandem, work cooperatively in a host of contingencies, starting with things like humanitarian assistance, but moving into more operational modes, joint patrols possibly, things like that. Again, in places, in geographies, and in functional areas where there is a keen common interest. The third area will be in terms of capacity building, which is helping India help itself in some ways, and it'll be two-way, but in this domain at least, will be more of a one-way cooperation, just because the US has greater resources. But by this I mean better defense research and development, better military equipment, so that India can work to achieve certain objectives, say, for example, in the boundary dispute with China. So in these three areas, again, we have seen considerable progress over the last 20 years. We will likely see accelerated progress, hopefully, in the next 5 to 10 years.
How in a US relationship, especially the military alliance, or it has been not even a question 20 years back, especially when India and US were on the opposite side in 1971, or we have seen 1998 when India tested the nuclear, conducted a nuclear test, and Pokhran, and US actually put a sanction on it. Did it all start, this relationship started building up with the nuclear deal, the 123 nuclear sanction, which Manmohan Singh and Bush government signed? Did it all start from there, the US-India relationship?
I mean, I actually think the nuclear tests were the key triggering moment, 1998 nuclear tests. And while you're correct that the US immediately not just imposed sanctions itself, but actually led other countries in imposing international sanctions against India, and blamed India primarily for it, even though by that time, both China and Pakistan had actually acquired a nuclear weapon capability. That actually was, in hindsight, the trigger for high-level engagement between the US and India. For the first time, the US sat up and took India seriously. And this led to what were known as the Strobe-Talbot-Jaswant Singh talks that started in 1998, extended into 99, so that by the end of 99, the US had actually removed those sanctions against India. And in 2000, Bill Clinton visited, and that was in some ways the start of the normalization between the two countries. But there were also antecedents to it. So in the mid-1990s, when Narasimha Rao visited the US, I think there was an effort at trying to move that relationship forward for a number of reasons, including the nuclear question. It did not progress immediately. There were also, I think, in some ways, the 1985 visit by Rajiv Gandhi to the US was a key turning point, in the sense that there was an attempt at trying to move India away from the traditional anti-American stance. There was, for the first time, there was cooperation. The US agreed to sell jet engines to India for its light combat aircraft program. So we started seeing the beginnings of military cooperation then. Again, that didn't progress very quickly and very fast for a number of reasons, including domestic politics in India, including the logic of the Cold War and the war in Afghanistan and other reasons. So all I'm saying is I think there was an attempt in the 80s to shift, arguably even earlier than that, but there wasn't a real attempt in 85 to change things, a real attempt in the mid-90s to change things. But 98, the nuclear test really triggered the engagement at that level. Two things I think subsequently happened. I think one was the Y2K crisis and the growth of the Indian services industry and the ICT sector particularly, where suddenly this view, the economic value of India grew significantly in the eyes of the US. I think 9/11 attacks in 2001 also meant that the India and the US saw the issue of international terrorism in similar terms, and again that pushed forward the cooperation. But again, the big breakthrough was, as you said, the Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2005, when what had until that point been a sort of more graduated level of conversation on high technology cooperation suddenly accelerated with the Civil Nuclear Deal. It was the Big Bang in some ways. That took 3 years to negotiate and conclude until the end of 2008. And that opened the room for, I think, a more robust defense cooperation. So something like defense sales, barring things like jet engines, was really negligible prior to 2005. Suddenly we started seeing things move on that front. India buying such things as the C-130 aircraft, P-8 aircraft. But also, the Malabar exercises taking on a multilateral dimension in 2007. The Quad for the first time meeting in 2007. So, yes, I do think the nuclear deal was a really major development in that respect. If that had not happened, we would not be seeing this level of cooperation today. But there were antecedents to it. I started to think of 98 as the big starting point in some ways. There was also, I'll finish on this note, I think there was also a period of slowdown. So while between 2005 and 8, we saw some very promising cooperation between India and US, the years after that, after the global financial crisis, from roughly 2009 to 14, saw a slowdown in the relationship. And again, there are a number of reasons for it. Some of it had to do with politics in the US, some of it had to do with politics in India. But I do think in hindsight, we will look upon those 5-6 years as a relatively a missed opportunity. It wasn't that there wasn't progress in that time period, there was, but it certainly wasn't as quick or as effective as it could have been, perhaps.
Yeah. So the last point before, since you mentioned this arms sales, I think this is the best point to bring out the Russia angle, because from 2001 to 4, the total number of arms sales or the trade that happened between India and US, it was around 400 million. And by the time 9 to 13, it was 10 times more, which is 5.7, I think, billion dollar in US terms. And it has increased over the years, as we have seen, and which US replaced Russia as one of the most, like the traditional defense supplier in terms of the value of trade. And with the US like India relationship growing up right now, the alliance that's turning up, do you think US will replace the kind of the traditional old friend that India had with Russia? How is Russia relationship will change with India?
No, so one is Russia still remains the number one defense supplier to India. I mean, it still has a commanding presence in the Indian market. If you look at licensed production of Russian equipment in India by companies like HAL and others, the Russia relationship remains pivotal for India's defense and security. That being said, you've seen other countries making inroads, the US number one, I mean, being one of them, but equally, I think France and other European countries and Israel have all made major inroads in the Indian defense market. Now, a few things are changing. I think one, there is a realization on the part of India, and this is not a new one, that any overdependence on any one country for arms is not good for your national security. It's not just about Russia. It's the one external supplier in so many areas compromises your ability to defend yourself. So this was, India was particularly hard pressed after the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia, when the Western countries, the US and European countries, put sanctions on Russia, and that really impeded India-Russia defense commerce. So I think we are seeing a diversification underway, where India is now trying to look at multiple partners for defense equipment. The US will remain, and I think perhaps the US share may even grow. Some of it, I think, is dependent on specific platforms. So there are certain platforms where the US is the world's leader and offers the best that there is to offer. Sometimes the only real platform that India could use in that case. So, the P-8s are a good example where the US has the best anti-submarine aircraft out there, and so it makes sense for India to look to the US for that. There are other things which Russia offers much more competitively, anti-air systems being one. So the S-400 system that India is acquiring from Russia is something that the Indian military feels is needed for its own security. But over time, you've also seen a shift now to a more self-reliant India. And there's now, particularly in the last 10 years or so, a really keen attempt to set up a private defense industry in India to compete with the Indian public sector institutions, such as HAL and HAL DRDO, the DPSUs and such. So, I think one of the things that India will be looking for increasingly is not just buying things off the shelf, although there will still be a need for that for various contingencies, but increasingly also looking for who will offer the best joint production terms, including technology transfers, including building up local supply chains, developing skills in India, bringing in investment into the Indian defense industry. And there, I think, in some ways, the US private sector is more competitive, and European entities are more competitive than Russian entities who do low-level license production much better. So this will play in favor of the one big issue though is cost. And I would say associated with that predictability of acquisitions. And unless India can, if India is willing to pay for it, it can acquire today. There's no longer the barrier for the technological barriers that were there 5, 10, 15 years ago on India from imposed by Western governments. Those have largely gone. Today, the question is really, can India afford it? And is India willing to pay market prices for this? And two, are they willing to, are you willing to offer the incentives for them to start manufacturing and developing these systems more in India? And if India can get those two things done, the budgetary aspects and the predictability, the policy predictability, that will obviously play in favor of India acquiring much higher technology from a variety of sources that will help over a 20-year period, over a much longer period, help the Indian indigenous defense industry so that India can become self-reliant over time.
Okay, so let's shift focus to what's happening in Afghanistan, right? So the Trump presidency has specifically been pushing India to adopt a more active role in terms of Afghanistan. How do you think that will change in the Biden presidency? How do you think that relationship specifically depends on the result of the elections?
Mm-hmm. So again, I won't characterize it again in those terms. The fact is, after 2001, after the toppling of the Taliban by the US, it was in fact India that wanted to play a bigger role in Afghanistan, particularly on the development aid side. And for many years, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration actually resisted Indian efforts at doing that and said, in their view, I think this was incorrect, particularly in hindsight, in their view, India's role, even a development assistance role, was adding to Pakistani insecurities and justifying Pakistan's support for terrorism against Indian and Western targets in Afghanistan. So for 15 years, India has been saying we have a direct security concern in Afghanistan. We want to help in the development of that country and its progress. And the US was saying no. So we've come a long way since then, where today the US is not obstructing India's ability to play a development role in Afghanistan to the extent that it. Now, I think what you may be referring to is the fact that at times President Trump has said publicly saying, oh, India should be doing more. Part of it is based on lack of information. He was briefed, for example, that India had built the parliament in Kabul, and he somehow misunderstood it and believed that they had said that India had built a library. So he went off on that. But the fact is, today India has been the 5th largest provider of development assistance to Afghanistan since 2001, and has contributed in very concrete terms to many elements of that country's development, from building hydroelectric dam projects, to investing in the mining sector, to being the 2nd largest destination for Afghan exports after Pakistan. 40% of Afghan exports today more than 40% go to India. It's the single largest destination for Afghanistan's air freight corridor program. Again, built the parliament building, built the road, connecting roads to the central ring road in Afghanistan, provided healthcare assistance, has helped with the media. So if you look at almost every aspect of state building in Afghanistan, India has played an important role there. And that's because India has very important equities there. What has changed in Afghanistan is, over the last 2 years, President Trump has committed publicly to drawing down the number of troops. And this is something that actually enjoys quite a lot of popular consent in the US. It's unlikely that a Biden administration, should Joe Biden be elected in a few days' time, would reverse that in a significant way. We're likely to see a very small US military presence in Afghanistan in the future. And this is natural. They've been there for 20 years. It's been the US's longest war. So I think there's a realization on the part of people in India that this is a natural outcome. This is going to happen. So the question now is how do you keep gains there? And I don't think a military troop presence is on the table at present, but a number of other options do exist for India to preserve its equities in Afghanistan. So I think what we've seen, in fact, is a much more, particularly in the last year or two, a much closer coordination between the US and India on Afghanistan, much more meeting of the minds. You've seen, in fact, trilateral conversations that have taken place between diplomats and officials from the US, India, and Afghanistan, which were not taking place a few years ago. So all in all, it's a much more constructive and coordinated relationship when it comes to Afghanistan today than it was for many years. But I don't think that this idea that the US is forcing India to have a troop presence there or do more there is in fact a valid characterization of what is going on.
But will the will the US be as actively vocal about asking India, urging India to be involved as Trump has been, if Biden gets elected?
Trump has mentioned it, I think, twice. So, again, I won't read too much into that. I don't think that there's been no official request or anything by the US for India to send troops to Afghanistan. So unfortunately, I think that this is a mischaracterization in the Indian media that is perpetuated by a notion of deep insecurity and is so devoid of any sort of real engagement between the US and India.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions. I'll link it together. So the first one is about the agreement that was signed between the US and the Taliban on 29th February 2020. It poses significant threat to India in places. First, it has a huge risk to do with terrorism. While the US-Taliban agreement states that Taliban will prevent terror outfits operating in Afghan soil, there's little clarity of how it's going to do. The second part is the Haqqani network that's there, and we know how ISI has links with them. And do you think the significant development that India has been doing on Afghan soil will be at a stalemate situation when Taliban comes to power, and India might have to deal with Taliban directly? And the instability, the political instability which might be there in Kabul. Right. How will this affect the India-Afghan relationship? And the second part of the question I have is, I think you might have seen the counterterrorism plus policy which Biden has proposed, and in which he has said that he emphasizes on fighting terrorist networks in foreign countries using small group of US special forces and aggressive airstrikes instead of large troop deployments. And with the president like Trump taking out troops from Afghanistan, and he on the other hand believes increasing airstrikes in the Middle East. Which are the policies you will think will have effective, which will be more effective in dealing with the arsenal that's gaslighting in the Middle East?
So, I think the problem, in assessing what is happening in Afghanistan is that there are a very large number of uncertainties there today. And I think, again, even in your question, you presumed a number of things that may happen, but may not happen equally. We don't know what form the Taliban will take as a governing entity in Afghanistan. What will be their role in governance? Will it be at the local level? Will there be a division of provinces? Will they have be in charge of certain ministries? If so, which ministries? In some ways, that is what the fighting currently is over. It's for jockeying for position, so a better negotiating position. So I think there's still very much question marks, both about the serious doubts about whether the Taliban will live up to its end of the bargain. I think, and that those doubts have only increased in the last few days as the violence has surged. There are doubts, even if there is a successful conclusion to the negotiations that are underway, as to what exactly the political end state looks like and what role will the Taliban take in any Afghan government. So I think this, again, inherent in your question was this idea that the Taliban will suddenly rule Afghanistan. There's still many doubts about that outcome and what kind of power sharing arrangement, if any, will take place. Now, this gets to the question of India's negotiation with the Taliban. And there is a strain of thought in India that the only good policy in Afghanistan must involve engagement with the Taliban. at a sort of political level. Now, there are two good reasons why India doesn't do that, hasn't and has been resistant to that. One is it gives greater legitimacy to the Taliban and undercuts India's own protestations about state sponsorship of terrorism on the global stage. But the second one, and I think perhaps the more important element, is that any overt outreach to the Taliban will undercut the democratically elected government in Afghanistan. And India has been, which India has been trying to support. So this idea that somehow a successful policy in Afghanistan should be equated with a public engagement with the Taliban is a somewhat flawed one if you keep in mind what India's interests are. So I'm not sure that the people who consistently been advocating for, well, India should talk to the Taliban and such, are necessarily keeping those realities in mind. Now, that being said, we are at a stage today where the Afghan government is in talks with the Taliban, and multiple stakeholders are involved in that negotiation process, and it is only natural that India should be involved in that negotiating process as well, given that India has stakes in that. So again, sometimes now you see the flip side criticism of why is India sitting at the same, are Indian officials sitting at the same table? Well, that's because that is what other countries are also doing. And if India is not represented at the table, then obviously India's interests will not be represented at the table. So I think that the combination of these uncertainties and keeping in mind Indian equities with this engagement mean that we are seeing this evolution of India's role in these negotiations playing forward as they have been playing over the last few months. People point to inconsistencies. I don't see an inconsistency in this respect necessarily. But where does it go forward? I think it really depends on what the end outcome is. India can, at best, India can hope that you see an easier sort of Afghan-led, Afghan-owned transition process and a reduction in the violence, and perhaps the evolution of the Taliban into a more political and less military entity. But again, that there's so many steps required between today's reality and that outcome that that looks very uncertain at this point of time. But again, it's very hard to assess how this will evolve just because the number of actors at play, not just the Taliban and the Afghan government, each is internally divided. You have the Islamic State as well now as a factor in Afghanistan. You have external actors, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, the United States, US allies. So all of that means that I think it's going to be a very hard set of negotiations for India in the way forward. Final point on this, the one thing I think Afghan national security forces do need and have been saying, they have been, so their infantry capabilities have improved a little bit, but there still is a need for artillery and air cover. And so those are areas where there have been requests for support from abroad. The US is quite possibly going to continue to provide at least some assistance in that area. But the problem with India has offered some helicopters secondhand. The challenge is these are Russian made kit and may not align with US provided equipment that has so far been the backbone of the INSF. So there's some challenges with the coordination when it comes to that.
So let's move to Pakistan. So the thing is, the US has been very vague on condemning Pakistan for being, for harboring, non-state actors of terror. So the US has been very vague about that. Will that change in a Biden administration, seeing that the polls seem to indicate Biden in the lead?
Yeah.
And how will that play in terms of Kashmir, considering Biden has previously vocalized his criticism of India and the handling of the abrogation of Article 370?
So again, I would question both those suppositions in your question. First of all,
Biden actually was awarded the Hilali Pakistan as well.
That's well known. But I would again look. The U.S. had deep interests and deep equities with Pakistan after 9/11 for a number of reasons. They needed some intelligence support, which the Pakistans provided a little bit of, but in many other areas actually hid support from, and this is now very well known and well documented. Second is they needed Pakistan's support for lines of communication to Afghanistan. So when there were 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan, they needed ground lines of communication to Afghanistan, and because of the relationship with Iran, the only way they really could do that was via Pakistan. There were also concerns, in my view, exaggerated concerns about Pakistan's nuclear program. And the Pakistanis used that to increase their leverage with Washington. So a combination of these things meant that the US took, from India's point of view, a rather soft and accommodating line on Pakistan-based terrorism that was directed against India. Now that has changed over time. This was certainly true in the early 2000s. I'd say the big tipping point was actually the Mumbai attacks in 2008. When American citizens were killed, the FBI became involved in the investigations. There was that in some ways was a watershed for US-India counterterrorism cooperation. G.K. Pillai, who was the defense secretary at the time, who was home secretary at the time, has spoken about this at length. The other change has really been in the last few years as the US has become less dependent on Pakistan for both terrorism, for both intelligence and for lines of communication to Afghanistan as the US troop presence has withdrawn. So if you see now at the Financial Action Task Force, for example, the US has in fact led criticism of Pakistan with obviously close coordination with India. If you see on the Pulwama attacks, the US actually condemned it in the strongest terms. If you look at the UN Security Council, arguably the US and France have been the countries that have been most critical of Pakistan-based terrorism targeted at India. So again, some of that view that the US has taken a more accommodating line was certainly true in the past, in 2001 and maybe 2011 after Osama bin Laden's killing. But 2011 was a very bad year for US-Pakistan relations. It's when we had the Raymond Davis incident. Around that time, we had the Salala incident when there was active shooting between NATO troops and Pakistani troops against each other. So I think since 2011, we've seen a much more, much better understanding between the US and India when it comes to Pakistan-based terrorism. And every major attack from Uri onwards, we have seen the US actually supporting India quite significantly, including, I think, quite notably at the FATF. Now, what changes if a Biden administration? I don't know if it'll change that much. A lot of the more painful episodes in US-Pakistan relations actually happened under the Obama administration. Again, 2011, 2012 or so was perhaps the low point between Osama bin Laden's killing, Raymond Davis, a number of other things happened around that time. So I don't think a Democratic administration would necessarily come in completely blind. There are a few elements, I think, vestiges of this India-Pakistan equivocation in the minds of some policymakers in the US that continues to this day. But I think my sense is that has diminished significantly in the past. And today, I think India and Pakistan, the idea that India and Pakistan should be treated on their own terms by the US was radical in the mid-2000s, in 2005, 6, 7. Today, that is considered a very commonplace assumption amongst most US policymakers.
So how do you think Biden's presidency will put focus when it comes to ties with India? And do you think, like we have seen how like Biden or the Democrats have called out things like the abrogation of Article 370 or the citizenship bill, where Trump had been, though he has called out for a mediation and said that he would be happy to mediate, but he has said most of the issues like the citizenship bill or the Article 370 are internal matters of India, and India is capable of dealing them on its own. How do you think this will shape up when Biden comes to power? I'll just give you one anecdote. In 2015, when Obama came to power, this was this town hall where he said that India will succeed when it actually when it actually maintains the it does not get split along the lines of religious faith.
Yes.
With the increase of polarization, and we have seen how things are happening in India when a Democrat holds office right now in this era. How do you think the relationship changes?
Yeah. So a couple of things, again, some context for the questions you are asking. You know, Trump has said on more than one occasion that he would mediate between India and Pakistan but this is the important part, if both parties agree to it. Yeah. Now, India is not going to agree to it, so it's a non-starter. There hasn't been any official US request to mediate, despite what Trump has said publicly. So again, I think he has said this thing, it's something that has been stuck in his head. He's repeatedly said this. I wouldn't deal with it as seriously as sometimes people take it, and particularly, obviously, those in Pakistan have more of an interest in taking it seriously. Of course, you know, quite famously, the one time he did mention this was in sitting next to Imran Khan in last summer in 2019, and we all know what happened just a little bit after that, which was the abolition of Article 370. Similarly, I think we've seen some mentions of Kashmir and religious freedom in party platforms. They have been very, by the Democrats, they've been very slight, and largely have been done to in the context of religious freedom rather than in the context of India or Asia policy. So while it is quite possible that the issue of religious freedom will be more on the agenda of a Democratic administration than a Republican administration, it is unlikely to be the defining aspect of a Democratic policy to India. In fact, in just a few days ago, Biden published something for Indian Americans. He spoke on August 15th of this year, gave a brief remarks, recorded remarks on relations with India. On a lot of these things, there is no overt allusion to the Kashmir issue. There is no overt mention even of critical of India on religious freedom. But I do think that there are mentions, of course, that about India's commitment to pluralism. What I think this will lead to, and one of the things that Biden has also spoken about at length, is a possible democracy summit next year if he's elected. And it is unlikely that there will be a successful summit, global summit on democracy hosted by the US if the world's largest democracy, India, is not represented there. So what this means is, I think we will have to have a much more honest and robust conversation between India and the US on issues of democracy and how Indian and American perspectives on that issue, where there will be differences, and there will be differences regardless of which party is in power in the US or in India. So that, I think, is something that should be much more squarely on the agenda for the India-US relationship, and will likely be so under a Biden administration. But again, I think this idea that somehow these slight mentions based on one or two remarks made by officials in certain contexts will somehow be the defining characteristic of their outreach to India or the region as a whole is, I think, mistaken.
Yeah. So let me bring this aspect of how Modi's personal equation with Mr. Donald Trump is. We have seen Mr. Modi attending the Howdy Modi
Yes.
the event that was being organized, and there's a slogans like "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar."
Okay.
Yeah. Does that if Biden comes to power, the question of if arises, do you think that will change certain equation of how the two democratically elected leaders will have?
Sure. So again, I think look at the context of that. When Modi came to Houston and did this event for Indian Americans, the Indian American community, Trump certainly attended. Nancy Pelosi, who is the Democrat Speaker of the US House of Representatives, was invited. She could not attend. Instead, her deputy, the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, came and spoke standing next to Prime Minister Modi. There was a large number of members of US Congress from both Republicans and Democrats who attended and appeared at that event. and they were introduced by the Democratic mayor of Houston. So this was a bipartisan event that was punctuated by the president of the US, who happens to be a Republican, Donald Trump, speaking at that event. This idea that it was a partisan exercise, I think, is devoid of that context. Now, when introducing President Trump, Prime Minister Modi said, we all remember 4 years ago when you said, when you were running for president, that you said, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar." Again, that was read in some quarters as an endorsement, but if you see again how it was said, it was not, that context needs to be taken into account. Now, it is natural that I think Prime Minister Modi should have wanted to establish a close relationship with the President of the United States, who happens to be Trump, who happens to enjoy large rallies, which was what happened in Houston and what happened when Trump came to India as well, in Gujarat. It is also natural that he should say nice things about him. But it's also true that Prime Minister Modi invited President Obama to Republic Day in 2015 and had a number of successful summits with him. So I think that has to be taken into account. Again, I think some people in India are taking a few things a little bit out of context and making a much bigger deal of it. And there has been some reporting to that extent in the Washington Post. My understanding is some Democrats were certainly rankled by some of the public shows of affection with President Trump. But I think what has been important to emphasize is that Indian engagement with the successive US administrations, Republican and Democrat, has been because this is to advance the US-India interest.
So, sir, in terms of US involvement in the South China Sea, in August, Trump actually blacklisted a few Chinese companies from trading with the US because of escalation in the South China Sea. And so how do you think US's policy towards the South China Sea might evolve? And how do you think, both candidates, their respective views towards it diverge?
So the South China Sea per se has been less of an issue in this campaign, partly because the US's locus standi there is a bit questionable. You have, there are two related issues on the South China Sea dispute. The one is China claims territorial waters that put it in direct contest with a number of other countries, specifically Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. Taiwan also has claims there. And while it's not a territorial claim, that there are also disputes over exploitation rights with Indonesia. So these are the countries that are directly involved with that. The US in that sense is not, although it is an ally of the Philippines and is a treaty ally of the Philippines. There's a second issue, which is a larger problem, which is that China's territorial claims in the South China Sea undermine freedom of navigation and overflight. And this is an important channel where the US, obviously as a trading power, has interest, but so does India, and so do others. And for this reason, the US has said that we are going to conduct what they call freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, where they will go within the maritime area claimed as territorial waters by China, and China has advanced those claims by building artificial islands. Now, this is again further complicated by two facts. One, the US has not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and so China uses that to say the US does not, is not party to that agreement. At the same time, there was an international tribunal that sided basically with the Philippines against China and said that China had no territorial claims in the South China Sea because it was building artificial islands. So, and it could not claim historical rights over the South China Sea. So that I think is where the situation lies. The South China Sea per se has not been an issue, but the question of Chinese assertiveness has been an issue. And on that, again, that applies not just in the context of India, in the context of the East China Sea and the disputes with Japan, Taiwan, particularly, very, very significantly, and the South China Sea as well. And on that, I think there is a growing bipartisan consensus that Democrats are also very concerned about this and are likely to want to continue pushing back against what they see as Chinese unilateral aggression in many of these places. Hong Kong was, I think, a major wake-up call for many people. Even those who are willing to give China the benefit of the doubt saw that the sweeping extraterritoriality of the Hong Kong national security law went further than they had imagined. So, I think that it is one factor that is contributing to a larger concern in the US about China that is not limited to one party or the other.
We have seen around February when Trump came to India, there was this press statement which he gave about the trade deal. I say that we can have a trade deal with India, but he's saying that he's really saving the deal for later on. And he does not know when it will come. It might not be done before the election, but a big trade deal is coming. So we have seen with this trade tension between India and US, which came up with US imposed higher duties on aluminum and steel imports. And later India removed beneficiary. I mean, then later removed India from the beneficiary of trade designation. And India, in retaliation, has imposed tariffs on US products. So what is the big trade deal they talk about? And how do you see US-India trade relations actually improve over time? Since we have already seen a trade war that went between US and China initially, and a lot of companies which should have come to India did not come.
So again, a few things for context for that question. One is, to the surprise of many people, before the coronavirus pandemic, actually US-India trade has actually been increasing over the last few years, which I think you would not necessarily know that from the rhetoric about the trade war. Second thing to keep in mind is the tariffs imposed by the US against India are a tiny fraction of the tariffs and other measures taken against China. It's nowhere close, 1/100th we're talking about of the value. So it's a very minor trade skirmish, if anything. Overall trade has actually increased, again, before the pandemic, which has taken a hit on trade globally. So again, just a few things to keep in mind on that front. Now, that being said, trade issues have been a major irritant in the US-India relationship for some time, and this was in the Obama years as well. It has only become worse in that sense after that. And largely it's because it's being held hostage to very specific lobby groups. So there's certain sectors in the US who say we want greater market access in India. So on dairy, on pharmaceutical, on medical devices, pharmaceuticals, non-generic pharmaceuticals. So there's and the US trade negotiators are representing those interests in some ways. That has made it difficult to conclude a deal, even though, again, the overall trade numbers are increasing. The deal that was on the table until recently was what was called a phase 1 deal, which was not going to be a grand bargain. It was going to be a relatively minor deal that would bring an end to the the sort of tit for tat approach. So it was a phase 1, which was hopefully then going to lead to a phase 2. And Trump, of course, in his way, spoke about the phase 1 deal, which was again an important but relatively minor sign of progress in much more sweeping terms. That did not work out for a number of reasons, but in part because I think there was a recognition on the Indian side that they did not want to do a deal just before the US elections, which would have given Trump a political win, and that there's a possibility that the Biden administration, which is less concerned about the trade deficit with India, would necessarily be as concerned on this issue. And so India could possibly have the negotiation could play more in India's favor. So for a combination of these reasons, we saw no phase 1 trade deal conclude this year. And I think even a few months ago, it was quite clear that they would not be one before the election. At the time of Trump's visit in February, it looked like a possibility, but a combination of coronavirus, the proximity to the election, and such meant that it became less so. So overall, I think we will see some difficulties on the trade negotiation side between the US and India in the coming years, unless they can be resolved. And I think it's better for both parties, obviously, that it is resolved favorably. To some extent, it will require the US to take a less specific sector by sector approach to this, which will not be popular with some business sectors in the US. For India, it will also require taking sort of a more accommodating line on some uncertain issues, and that's that's inherent in any trade deal that is concluded. But overall, the trade numbers are actually not looking so bad, and there's certain areas, including defense and energy, where there's been a significant increase of U.S. exports to India. The trade deficit has actually narrowed in the last 2 years. So again, I would separate again the view of trade negotiations, which are quite difficult between US and India, both bilateral and multilateral, with, on the other hand, the actual reality of the trade and economic relationship between the two countries, which is on a much more positive trajectory.
So I think this is the last topic that I want to talk to you about. It's the H-1B visa, which a lot of Indian media channels have been covering, especially with the new interim that was being imposed. Trump imposes this curb on H-1B visa to protect US workers ahead of the election. And I think it was a H-1B non-immigrant visa program, which aimed at protecting American workers, restoring integrity, and better guarantee that H-1 visa petitions are approved only for qualified beneficiaries. So what is this entire thing that was happening around H-1 visa during the pandemic we have seen as well? And we have seen also a lot of student visas as well. Students have been asked to go back to the countries. What are the plans for Biden and Trump for H-1B visa, since it is one of the most popular visa among a lot of immigrants? How does this shape up post-election, and what is this thing that's going on with H-1 visa, the recent amendment?
Sure. So let me start with some background. The H-1B visa is a non-immigrant visa meant for high-skilled workers to come on normally a 3-year and extendable for another 3-year basis. It is very largely subscribed by Indians. Indians are overwhelmingly sort of overrepresented amongst H-1B visa holders in the US. And it is used especially by Indian tech companies who depend upon it for importing high-skilled labor to work in the tech sector in the US. Now, this H-1B visa program is deeply unpopular on both the right and the left, because there's a belief that it is coming at the expense of jobs, US jobs. And so it's not just on the right amongst Republicans, even people on the left have deep reservations about the H-1B visa program. But because of a lack of overarching immigration reform in the US due to a gridlock on that issue, this has not been addressed. Now, recently, President Trump has signed a number of executive orders that have suspended a number of immigration programs, including H-1B visas. Students have been affected by the coronavirus pandemic significantly. The process of attaining a green card has been further complicated. So a combination of Trump executive orders and the coronavirus pandemic have meant that the 4 categories of Indian travel to the US that are most important, which is green cards, H-1Bs, student visas, F visas, and tourist visas, B visas, have all taken a big hit this year, and numbers are significantly down. Whether this becomes permanent or not will depend to a great degree on the outcome of the election, not just the presidential election, but the congressional elections as well, because any comprehensive immigration reform will require a role to be played by Congress. What Biden has said is that he would make it easier to attain green cards through a professional track. So on the green card account, he has promised very explicitly that it would be easier for Indians who are currently, again, face limitations on that front. They'd be more encouraging of students, and tourists, of course, will probably bounce back after the pandemic. But the question of H-1Bs will be a bit more difficult. There is still a strong view that the US needs to evolve eventually into a more points-based migration system. But if that happens, and this is something that like Australia and others have, if that happens, that would still play in favor of Indians, because it would prioritize workers who are English speaking, who have STEM degrees, science, technology backgrounds, who are younger, who are educated, have higher education. And again, a very large number of those subscribers are likely to be Indian. So Overall, I think the H-1B program itself faces some bumps in the road, regardless of the outcome of the election, although a Biden administration would be less instinctively against it than the Trump administration. But I think it's only a matter of time before you see a much more comprehensive immigration package on high-skilled immigration that would replace the H-1B visa program and put in place something else to attract high-skilled labor, of which, again, a very large number will continue to be Indian.
So before we end this, at present, Mr. Biden is ahead of the US presidential election. And do you expect a Biden-Harris win in December? And how does the Indian American votes play in this election?
So currently the polls are showing quite clearly that Biden is favored to win. In some cases, the polls are looking quite strongly in his favor, beyond margins of error. I think the only way that Trump will win will require some combination of three things to happen. One, the polls have to be quite wrong. That is less likely because there's much better polling this time than in 2016. Second is they would require him to just take the swing states. In some ways, this election will really hinge on 5 to 10 states. If he wins 7 of those 10, Trump could win, even if it's by small margins. The third possibility, of course, is that a combination of low voter turnout by the Democrats and some voter suppression by the Republicans will play in favor of Trump. But there's almost no chance that Biden will not win the popular vote. He will probably win 50% of the vote, or at least be the largest vote getter. There's still some uncertainty about whether Biden will win the Electoral College. Again, the models today suggest that there's about a 1 in 8 chance of Trump winning, the 7 in 8 chance of Biden winning. But that being said, there are always surprises.